Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with Professor Emeritus Gail Green, also quasi-historian, because we're talking about history here. And we sit down and we talk about her most recent book, which is called Immeasurable Outcomes, Teaching Shakespeare in the Age of Algorithms. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this episode today is a little bit more specific than I usually get. It's geared definitely towards educators and anyone who's interested in education. If that's not your jam, I totally understand. There'll be a narrative episode out again in another few days. But I really enjoyed the conversation because it's not very often that I get to have a fellow educator on the show and talk about the value of the liberal arts education. As I mentioned in the interview, I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and with degrees in English literature and history, two fields that are flagging today in terms of their interest, to say it nicely. And I still work in education to this day, as I mentioned again in the interview as we're talking here. And so it is important to me that individuals understand the sort of state of the union when it comes to education in the United States. One of the things I always question is, what was so wrong about the way that education was being handled prior to 2001? It's really kind of interesting because I graduated from high school in 2001. The first election that I voted in was Bush v. Gore with the whole hanging Chad thing. So I didn't do a lot of standardized testing. And a lot of you who are my age or older probably didn't do a lot of standardized testing either. But my guess is you're doing fine. I'm doing fine. I had a lot of great teachers in high school, and I'm very appreciative of the efforts that they made. But I can honestly tell you that none of them, thinking back on it, do I say, I really loved this teacher's class because she administered really great standardized tests. That's just not the sort of thing that inspires a student, believe it or not. So, in this interview, there's a fair amount of complaining about the way that education is being handled nowadays. But I do think there's a nice bright spot at the end when we start to talk about the different ways in which education might be changed to make it, for lack of a better word, more engaging again, more interesting for everyone. Now, final spoiler alert before we get going. This is one of those interviews where we ran into some pretty major technical issues at the outset that forced me to switch gears and use an entirely different recording method. Said recording method, which shall remain nameless, cut off the interview at a time when we weren't probably all the way done with the conversation. So, again, spoiler alert, it's going to end rather abruptly, and you'll hear from me alone at the end with my kind of final thoughts. So, without further ado, the interview. Okay, so I'm sitting down here, as I just mentioned, with professor and historian Gail Green. I'm talking about her new book, Immeasurable Outcomes, Teaching Shakespeare in the Age of the Algorithm. This is a book that it didn't take much to get me interested in it. I am a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. Talk about the Wisconsin idea maybe a little bit later on, with degrees in English literature and history, undergraduate degree thesis in King Lear, and master's thesis in Great Gatsby. So it doesn't take much for me to want to talk about liberal arts education and the importance of the liberal arts education and all that we have lost in some of the last couple decades. So thank you so much for coming on. But I think that to start, we really have to define what we mean by liberal arts, because the term, and I'm going to put air quotes around it here, liberal, has really sort of transformed and taken on a life of its own in the last 10, maybe 15 years. And so it's important to sort of divorce that concept from how it is colloquially used today. So I was hoping you could start out by just maybe defining that term for the audience so that they understand what we're talking about here.
Sure. I mean, because lots of people do not. It does not mean left-wing, progressive. It has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with, I like to go back to Cicero's definition. He was the great senator of the 1st century BC, Rome. Those Romans knew a lot. And liberal means, it's related to free. To free, liberare, to free. So the Cicero talks about the skills that enable a man, and it was man, that was really what they meant, because that's all that mattered in those days, but, they didn't know everything, the Romans, but they, to be a free man as opposed to a slave, and that means to acquire the skills of citizenship, to live in the world, to know how to negotiate, navigate the world. That only sounds simple. That's a skill we really need today, because people just don't know how to live in this world that is so incredibly complex, and that there are so many agendas for us. So freedom, as the Romans knew, required knowledge, required education, knowing something about the world. Liberal arts do not mean fine arts. They don't mean the artsy-fartsy, the kind of thing that guarantees unemployment in most people's minds. They mean skills. So liberal arts are really practical skills of living in the world. And that's a really important thing. And one of the things, another thing implied by this is general education, broad-based knowledge of something about the world, something about oneself, something about the past, where you are in the world, where you are in the cosmos. That's quite different from a specialized education that teaches you skills of how to be a pharmacologist or how to be an accountant or whatever pre-professional degrees that are gaining in popularity disastrously, to my mind, because really we need this broad-based general education. So the humanities are kind of a subset. And actually, also, I should say the liberal arts once still includes the sciences. It's the arts and sciences, because the sciences are also not applied sciences, mind you, not, petrochemicals, but a knowledge of the way the world works, the physical world, biology, physics. So the opposition between the sciences and the arts is a false one. It really is, because the sciences are included, also the social sciences. What teaches you about the world and how to live in the world, essentially? And that's really important. That is not frills, and it's not left-wing indoctrination. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to understand that, and I don't want to go too far into the question of politicalization of history, because I could talk about that for a really long time. That's nothing new. But the idea of being able to live as a citizen, when you go back and you look at a lot of the classical sources. And those who have listened to the podcast narrative will understand that, a lot of the things that the Greeks and the Romans were talking about, in the 2nd century, 1st century BCE, and then into the early imperial period, was about how to be a good citizen. Like, being a virtuous person was about understanding how to be beneficial to your polis if you were, in classical Greece, and then ultimately a citizen in the Roman world, in the Roman Empire. And that meant understanding a lot of things. It wasn't a simple definition. It's not just civics as we define it today, although I think civics is actually making a pretty good comeback in terms of how we think it's important. It turns out in the last 7, 8 years, we've decided, oh my goodness, we do need to spend a little bit more time educating people on civics. So folks like me find themselves teaching government again. But those are all important things. But it's important, and I'll come back to this later on. But I think this idea also of sort of a shared, I don't know if heritage is the right word, but a broad-based shared education can be an important cohesive factor in a lot of civilizations that we see going through. But we'll get back to that. I want to I'll stick to the book here for a little bit. You talk in the book about the value in a liberal arts education, and there's this sort of tension that has developed in the last, decade, 2 decades. I guess No Child Left Behind was early 2000s, so I suppose we're coming up on quarter of a century now, believe it or not. But the interesting thing is that it seems like when you look at tech moguls and people who are pushing the idea of algorithms, standardized testing, so on and so forth, when it comes to educating their children, they take a very different path. They tend to send their children to schools that don't use as much technology, that emphasize things like small class sizes, personal connections, so on and so forth. It appears that they know the answer. So why don't we do it, at least at the K-12 level? Where's this disconnect coming from?
What one wants for oneself is often not what one wants for other people. I mean, you see this very strongly in Bill Gates, who has this idea he calls personalized education. It's actually sitting at a computer and following prompts to a predetermined right answer. That's good enough for other kids in Gates's view, but it's not good enough for him or for his family, who he sends to Lakeside, this very posh, well-resourced Seattle private school. He knows what works. Everybody knows what works. It's really no mystery what works in education. I mean, people need people, kids need teachers. They need parents, first of all. They need support. We learn from other people. That's the kind of species we are. We have a long period of vulnerability in which we look up, for directions. We look to faces, we hear tones of voice. That's a human species. And everybody knows this, but when it comes to education, first of all, it's other people's children. It's not our children. This is the thinking that goes into it. And what the idea, it's scale and efficiency is what we're looking for. We're looking for cost cutting. We're looking for something cheap, something that works, something that's, scalable. We're also looking for people who are going to be good employees, who are going to follow orders. By good employees, I don't mean creative or innovative. That stuff is fallen by the way in this kind of mass education. We're looking for people who will sort of assume their places uncritically, unthinkingly, unquestioningly in the social order that we've predetermined. And the best way we can get that is to reduce education to this, predetermined testing. That's what No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and the Common Core have made of education, teach to the test. And that's where the humanities fall off the spectrum because, they're not tested. What is taught is what is tested. Humanities, arts, history, the literature, forget it. We don't need that in the utilitarian kind of education I've described. Now, Gates is a really complicated guy. I think his intentions are good. I don't think he actually understands what he's done here, with this kind of incredible split. In fact, I've seen a recent quote where he says, we need small classes and more teachers. What? Can the man possibly have learned something? Maybe. He's admitted mistakes. But he's a techno-managerial, he's made his fortune with systems, right? Finding a system. That's what he understands best. And he has said education is an engineering problem, and he talks about students as though, he says, standardization is necessary because it enables innovation. If you have a standardized electrical plug, I'm quoting him here actually, if you have a standardized railroad gauge, it works. I mean, that's how a system works. You need standardization. Well, the problem is that students are not electric plugs and they're not railroad gauges. They're not objects, but that's the kind of thinking he engages in. And he's also incredibly competitive. He's hyper competitive. Everybody who's ever worked with him, known him, describes him in these terms. And so he sees he confuses test scores with education. And if we can raise test scores, then we've educated kids. Well, there's a big problem with that because test scores are not education, as we know, as any teacher knows, as anybody who's been in the classroom 5 minutes knows. A standardized test is no measure of a student's learning. So that's a confusion also. I mean, look, the guy is a college dropout, He's one of the smartest men. He's a very smart man. He's very smart. But he never finished college. Now I wish he'd stayed around Harvard long enough to take some humanities classes. He might have learned a little bit about how it actually works. Another thing is he doesn't listen. I mean, people have been trying to get through to him. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm on this Gates wagon here, but he truly just does not take into account the interpretations of other people. Teachers have been writing books, articles, seeking interviews with him. He has his own cherry-picked teachers. I mean, the teachers who will tell him what he wants to know. This has all been written about much better than I was actually trying to write about it. I mean, I was trying to write 2 books as I wrote this book, and I had to drop this part. But Diane Ravage's books will tell you all about, what I've just been saying. Also, there's a book called Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door by Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. It's kind of a wonderful book also about what teaching to the test has done to education and this mechanized kind of, standardized mentality.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of things here where it's like, we are coming out of COVID, when we saw the full effects of saying, well, we'll just put children in front of screens, for hours at a day, and it'll be fine. And now, even the test scores and statistics are proving it wasn't fine. That didn't work. That those aren't the sorts of things that worked. And of course, it's one of those things that it should be obvious. You cannot have a standardized education platform that is also personalized. That those two things cannot be at the same time. It's not possible. So if it's going to be student driven, then there's going to have to be what you call student choice. And if there's student choice, then it can't be standardized, so on and so forth. But as you were talking, I was struck, and I was just remembering because I was just rereading Howard Zinn's A People's History, and he talks in one of the chapters about education and sort of the exact same thing, that the purpose of education was to produce malleable employees who would do what they're told, in this case in factories, and follow orders and so on and so forth. And that was the goal of education. And I wonder sometimes how far we've come from that. And as someone who studies history, I know certainly history isn't linear. Sometimes we make progress, sometimes we go back. And so those are useful things to think about. But transitioning to sort of the next thing I wanted to ask you about was the interplay between government and education and how much that has changed over the last 60 years. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we have this idea there called the Wisconsin idea, which is that the university is supposed to benefit the state and the state is supposed to benefit from the university. It's supposed to be a symbiotic relationship. Well, that kind of changed, at least in the views of some people over a period of time. So, how dramatically has this interaction between our government and education changed in the last, half century or so?
Yes, very dramatically. But the thing that you have to realize about government is that it's really kind of governed by money. I mean, the power is not in the people. The power is in the billionaires. I'm sorry, it's really a plutocracy we're in. We're not a democracy anymore. We're an oligarchy. And so business has always been looking for ways of controlling education for the reasons we've just described, because you want, you want a workforce, and you want a compliant workforce. And they found a way, finally, to do it through George Bush with No Child Left Behind. That was a huge change of government intervention in curricula. I mean, Diane Ravitch says, this is illegal. The government is not supposed to tell teachers how to teach. But suddenly, when you set up this testing system, you're telling teachers what to teach. They're supposed to teach the test. And if they don't get high test scores, the teachers get dismissed, the schools get closed. That was really draconian under No Child Left Behind. Obama adopted it. Just took it over, changed the name, called it Race to the Top. And then Gates came in with a Common Core. Now, and they say, we're not fiddling with your curricula. Well, of course they are. They're making teaching into testing in mathematical skills and in reading skills. That's all, we're not concerned with Shakespeare. We're not interested in, except as we may teach figures of speech, it's also got to be computer administered, this kind of teaching. So, that's part of the standardization. It's also, of course, big bucks for technology. It's big bucks for testing companies. It was hugely profitable, No Child Left Behind. And an unprecedented involvement of what you call government, what I call money, business in dictating what is taught. Now we get these, right-wing loonies who are saying you can't talk about Black history. You can't talk about anything that makes students uncomfortable. What? Excuse me, education makes people uncomfortable. It does, because it takes us out of our comfort zone. If we don't want discomfort, well, just close your mind then. And that's what's being advocated. Just close your mind. Don't think about this. Anything that makes you uncomfortable. Anyway, yes, it's been unprecedented and disastrous. But as I say, I would call it business. The story of No Child Left Behind is really not a pretty story. There were huge investments in educational technology. The Bush family itself was heavily invested in it. McGraw-Hill. The Bush investment stocks, several of them, McGraw-Hill being the main one, were testing and educational companies that just made huge profits from this law that was passed. It's kind of sinister, actually. And as I say, other people have written about this. This is actually not my book we're talking about so much. I'm talking about what we can do, not what other people have done wrong. But, of course, they're related in that we are trying to undo we're trying to humanize what has been dehumanized. Education has essentially been, in mechanizing and standardizing it, you're dehumanizing it. And education is about the development, a liberal education, about the development of the human being, of the human mind. It's also about the development of, as you say, a citizen. Somebody who can be responsible to other people. It's not about test, scores. It's just not. This is where, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And it's also interesting to me because it strikes me that, if we want to produce, if the goal is, and the stated purpose often is, we need the education system to be more in line with the economy. We need the education system to produce the kind of workers that we need. It's interesting to me because it strikes me as I sort of look at where the economy is going that we need critical thinkers.
Well, I know.
We
Yeah.
need people who are creative. We need people who are going to think outside the box. Shouldn't the education system be pushing students in that direction?
It thinks it is. I mean, Gates would say this is rigor, and George Bush, that's his favorite word, rigor. But it's really penny wise and pound foolish. I mean, you can't whip kids into creativity. I mean, the way you get creativity and the innovation that industry claims it wants is you give them range, is you give their imaginations range. You try to stimulate, you try to inspire. You don't, the difference between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is where creativity comes from, where the mind roams and makes connections, makes new connections and associations. And Aristotle understood that. He said metaphors are the basis of genius. Well, what metaphor is bringing two things together. So you do, in the classes I taught, that they ranged all over the place. We talked about, Shakespeare was the basis, but Shakespeare's about people, it's about relationships, it's about people who make mistakes, which is really fascinating. You look at the mistakes that the tragic heroes make, and they're kind of an object lesson in reading well and interpreting and in hearing and in listening and attending, which is really important for living with other people, and learning that you can disagree and yet you can get along. You don't have to have civil war. Convergent thinking is a multiple choice exam. You have a right answer. You have one right, and you're supposed to look at the four choices or whatever, and you're supposed to get the right answer. Well, the questions we bring up in a Shakespeare class, there are no right answers to. What is man? Sorry, I'm using that generically. What kind of a creature is the human creature? What are we, and what are we living for? And why are we here? And what do we want to do with our lives? There's no right answer to that. A multiple choice exam will get you nowhere. I passed a course on the basis of a multiple choice exam. I knew nothing. It was Physics 10 at Berkeley. I wouldn't have taken the final because I'd stopped going to class after 3 weeks because it was just hurting my head, frankly. It was like a brick wall. I couldn't grasp it, and it was taking away from other courses that I really cared about. So if I hadn't heard the exam was multiple choice, I would have skipped the final. Somebody said it was multiple choice, so I waltzed in 10 minutes late, waltzed out 10 minutes later. Every eye in the room is on me, and I got a C. And my roommate did the same thing, and she got a D. She was furious at me. And it was random. It was, it wasn't entirely random because I was, by this time, kind of savvy about taking tests. And that's really what test taking measures, is how well you take tests. And that measures, of course, socioeconomic strata, because the people who take the test the best are the people who've had the SAT tutors, whose parents have talked to them, who've heard zillions of words by the time they're 10 years old, as opposed to other people who've heard no words. And by the way, that is how people learn, from other people. I've said that before. Come back to that point. It's huge, That's why you can't, educate your kid by putting them in front of the television set. That's not how they learn. You talk to them. And people with, the means to do that know that. We know that about educating kids. So that's why small classes matter. And it's why a teacher who can take an interest in a student, as I loved my kids, and they were my kids. I taught at Scripps for 40 years. And I got to know them. I'm still in touch with them on Facebook. I'm watching their kids grow up. That's something our students do. They raise the next generation, That's important. That's much more important than test taking, because it is human, And so what you teach ripples out into the whole world. And this is where, the civic education comes in. It's broader than the civics course.
It's also just more engaging. Let's be honest.
Oh, yeah. Well, absolutely. Yeah.
You just can't, previous to this year, I was in a different public school teaching, and this is just one example, but I had never seen test mania to this extent. The only thing that we ever did was practice multiple choice questions for the test. So every Monday we would hand out the packet for that week that just had different paragraphs. They'd read it, circle the things, and they hand it back. And that was it. That was the only thing that we ever did. There was never... I don't think they ever wrote a sentence, because there's no writing on the test. So what would be the point, right? It was, but you could just see that. I mean, how could you possibly, as a student, be excited about this? It's the most dull thing in the world, and there's no there's no mistake here, right? We're seeing huge declines in the interest of students when it comes to reading, because we're not maybe even allowing them to read what they want to read anymore, and that's becoming a major problem. At least that's what I see.
Yes. Absolutely. No. And what I'm reading about now is disengagement, particularly since COVID. I mean, they've come back and they really haven't come back, I mean, they're just checked out, they're tuned out, and enrollments are falling. I mean, that's really scary because, that's really the undoing of the higher educational system, which really was the envy and pride of the country, of the world. I mean, we had the best educational system in the world. It's what gave this country prominence and power was this broad base and of a liberal art. An engineer would come out knowing something about the implications of the dam he built on the environment, or an architect on the housing project on the neighborhood. I mean, there was you make context with the liberal arts education, and you tear it apart and you try to slot kids into the right answer so that they'll become your employees and you can increase your bottom line, and you destroy it. You utterly destroy it, because kids need to want to learn, and you can beat them into this kind of submission with a multiple choice exam. You can raise your numbers a little bit, but you're not educating a human being that way. And it's quite suicidal, really. I mean, it's really killing the goose that laid the golden egg for us, for this country. I mean, but the disengagement I read about is, and I'm not in the classroom anymore. I have been retired for almost a decade. But I hear and read that this disengagement is truly terrifying. You have more direct experience of this than I do. Kids checking out. Well, naturally they're checking out. It's not interesting. They can't connect with it. I mean, kids have to connect with the subject. They have to want to learn. And the other thing that's been beaten out of kids is pleasure in education. I mean, I found this that to get the idea across that Shakespeare's fun. Shakespeare's actually really fun. I mean, he writes plays, Plays there's a connection between the word play and play. I mean, there's a lot of play in his plays. There's word play, there's games, there's all kinds of play. It was not so easy for them to get that. As I saw the, results, the consequences of reform, that pleasure had been beaten out of education. They didn't think a class could be fun, so they wouldn't get my jokes, I mean, it wouldn't, and you could see them gradually easing up in the course of a semester. Pleasure is important because it's the basis of motivation. If you don't like something, you're not going to come back to it and back to it and back to it enough to learn it, to really internalize it.
Yeah, so I guess kind of, there's a lot of problems, right? But, what do you think we could do? What would be some things that we could do to maybe try to turn the system around?
Yeah, well, it of course, depends on what you mean by we.
Society, sure. let's.
I mean, we need to keep in mind, we need to question everything we hear about education, first of all. There's a huge amount of misinformation out there. The people who talk about education, who get airtime, not this airtime, I'm happy to say, I'm happy to be here. But generally, when the New York Times does an article on education and consults an expert, it's somebody from a think tank. It's a top-down expert. It's a policy wonk. And one of the things we, the public, needs to know how to do is to check the source of information. Who's funding this think tank that this person is representing? And to think what you want for your kid. I mean, do you want your kids to, be a pharmacologist in Walmart or something? I mean, because that's a way to an instant job, quite well-paying job, and regret it 40 years later in their lives and wish they could have done something that they loved. I mean, that's a huge thing. But I think above all, checking one's sources. What one hears about education. It's just, when it comes to education, you need to trust the teachers, you need to trust the educators, and not the policy wonks, the people who are coming from the top down, like Gates is a real top-down thinker, well-intentioned as he may be. And try to understand education and stop bashing teachers, for God's sake. That teacher bashing that went on with, because teachers were getting blamed for poverty, essentially, when you beat up on teachers for test scores, you're really deflecting attention from the underclass that the society has created by the wealth division. The division between wealthy and poor is greater than it's been since the Gilded Age. And teachers can't turn poverty around, but it has been claimed that they can. And this is a problem created by society, and then you shove it off to the teachers. That's it. That's got to stop, and that's got to be understood as a mechanism, the social mechanism, a deflection of attention from some social problem that would cost money to repair. Corporations don't want to spend money. They don't want to give their workers, living wages. They don't want to bring up wages. They don't want unions. They don't want regulations. They certainly don't want regulations. And that's what the society has pushed toward, is a deregulated, free for them, not free for the rest of us, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure where we'll be in 20, 30 years. I wonder what, if anything, public education might look like. Will it be simply all charter schools, and the maybe large public schools for the very indigent, and that could be a stratification. I can just say for my 2 cents, for anyone who asks me, and since I have this platform, I'll give it out there. Maybe we don't need, quite this many administrators to just make sure that the tests are being given. Like, we may be able to have some smaller class sizes if we weren't paying so much money for the folks at the very top of the system. But that's my 2 cents.
No, that's absolutely true. The bureaucratization of both K-12 and higher education has just been such a drain. Outcomes assessment, we haven't really talked about assessment of teachers, of what are you producing? Let's see your results, student learning outcomes. So there's an entire industry is burgeoned up around that. Incredible amounts of money go to administrators. Administrators have gone up 260 times or something like that. To faculty, faculty salaries have gone up 10%. It's ridiculous. I'm not sure those are the numbers, but it's the disproportion is pretty much the way the CEO salaries have gone up in relation to, the worker. When I grew up, somebody who worked in a factory made I mean, the CEO made like 20 times more than that. Okay, you can kind of live with that. Now it's 350. It's absurd, So that's the same thing that's happened in K-12 schools, in public schools, and in university and colleges. It's a tremendous drain of resources. The other drain has been technology. People have bought into, let's get this new program, because some snake oil salesman has come by. I mean, they're very persuasive, these salesmen, and sometimes they're selling important things, and sometimes, often they're not. And there's awful boondoggles that have happened, like this is in Ravage and Berkshire's work. The amount of money that's squandered on techno fixes, while nurses, counselors, teachers, there's librarians. They're laid off. Schools, big public schools, don't have nurses, librarians, anymore. And the class sizes increases, and it's a very bad allocation of resources. So that should certainly be addressed.
And that, folks, is where we got cut off. And I again apologize to Professor Green and to everyone else involved in the process. It was not my intention to go down that road in the first place, but here's where we ended up. So at the end of the day, certainly education in America is probably more of a hot button issue than I suppose maybe even it should be. It's talked about significantly. In fact, it's hard to remember, I'm going back now a couple of presidential elections. It's hard to remember a time when education played such a focal point in some of the public political discourse as it has in, say, the last 5 to 10 years. And I don't know if that's a good thing, and it might be, but at the same time, I will continue to echo the words of Professor Green that, as an educator, we are the ones who are being paid to support our nation's students, and I guess I just hope you trust us to do that. In any event, there's a lot more in the book. Obviously, we didn't get to it because we got cut off mid-sentence. But if you're interested, link is in the show notes, like it always is for all of the books. Feel free to check it out. It's an incredibly easy read. If you've got, a teacher in your life, it would make a wonderful, Valentine's Day present. That's right. Get them a Valentine's Day present. Get them this book for Valentine's Day. Put a little heart on it. They'll love it. With that being said, we're back to the narrative. Up on Friday, we are getting into Hernan Cortez and the conquest of Old Mexico.